My name is David Boji. I'm a professor and I'm also a blacksmith. I'm here to talk about something called quantum storytelling. Most of my life has been spent in academia, the last 30 years developing theories and practices and methods for storytelling. In the last, I'd say 6 years, since I got into blacksmithing, I've been very interested in how storytelling is related to art and the expression of something called quantum physics. I'm going to draw a lot on the ontology work of Martin Heidegger, my own background work and working with Mikhail Bakhtin, Hannah Arendt, who wrote a book on the human condition. And I'll take you through a number of D concepts, which I hope is a language to talk about quantum storytelling in art and relate it to quantum physics and the blacksmithing processes. And in each case, I'll talk about processes of blacksmithing so you can ground it in that whole worldhood and finding a whole self in that way. And for me, it's been an amazing journey. So I hope you enjoy it. Well, the directionality of the process is something I call quantum storytelling. And it's part of a number of Ds. But directionality, for example, with this hammer, the hammer has a particular directionality in the context of all of the equipment in that shop. And this hammer is used for particular things and it's used in a particular way. It's in terms of where it stands in the process, right? And it stands in a particular relationship to all the other tools in the shop. The Dateability or Dateability is particular dates of high significance. Now, when I purchased this Brent Bailey hammer, right, I bought this in 2010 at a SWABA convention. And it was a significant date for me because that's when I made a commitment to take my blacksmithing to a higher level by investing in some good tools. So it's a very dateable moment. Okay, duration has to do with time, but it's not the duration of like minutes or seconds or hours. Okay, it has to do with being in the moment and you don't even notice time, right? And you can be so busy hammering and just pounding away on your anvil. And I'm in this other world. I'm in this blacksmithing world, the whole worldhood of blacksmithing. And I didn't even know that I'm married, that I'm on this planet. I'm just in that space. So that's called duration. Okay, we're talking about a disclosability of the future here. It's not a disclosability of the past like you have in narrative, where you're just going looking backwards in time and trying to figure out the past. Here I'm trying to figure out the future. Now in quantum physics, there's a particular process that I want to talk about called the spark test. And so if I was going to test this hammer face, doing a spark test to see how much carbon was in there, right? And carbon is in relatively small amounts in the iron that you use in blacksmithing. But the relative amount of that carbon, you can test for that using what's called a spark test. And since they invented grinding wheels that spun, and they would be able to test metal to see how much carbon content was on there. You have two slits, in this case it'll be metal that were made, and we're going to drive sparks through those slits at the same time. Now if it's a particle, we should only see two lines, two bands, right, separated a little bit. If we're getting wave effects and interference and those sparks are interfering with each other, we might get that wave effect. Okay, destining has to do with fate or destiny. Now, instead of having a real tight fate that's deterministic, right, where you're determined to be this particular character and you're growing into that self, as a blacksmith, I'm interested in a weaker kind of destiny, a destining in quantum physics sense says when you do the double slit experiment, and whether it's a wave or particle, both destinies are possible. So somehow that bothness is a destining in quantum physics. And that's part of the destining of the future in the moment of vision of seeing and interpreting what I think that blacksmithing art could look like made with blacksmithing processes. Deployability has to do with in order to, for the sake of which is real important in blacksmithing. In a shop, you know, you're deploying all kinds of processes for the sake of your art, for the sake of creating your art and producing the future of that art. So you need a quantum storytelling language, I think, and you need quantum storytelling processes to deal with that deployability. So you could talk about in order to from the idea of mechanistic physics, but you'd be in that old cause-effect language where the past determines the present. Now I'm looking at a different kind of causality of the future to the present, the future to the past, and that's a different quantum storytelling where you leave open the potential for wave and particle to both happen, right? And it's a different thinking. It's a different way of conceiving the world. It's a different way of being in the world, and that's why we're talking about this today. Dwelling means there's a place for every tool in the shop. A place for this hammer. Hammer has its special place. Tongs have its place. Now there's a difference in the present at hand tools in that shop and the tools that are ready to hand. In the demonstrating the forging, you saw me use a couple different hammers. Those hammers were ready to hand in that process. They were available, they were ready. I'm using them in that moment for that process. The other way that you can look at the tools in your shop is they're present at hand. Maybe they're arranged somewhat randomly, maybe they're not used all that much. Those are present at hand, they're present in the shop, but they're not really part of the process, the creative process of production of art. I talk about disseverance. Disseverance can happen in dissevering of time, dissevering of space, and dissevering of matter. So in a quantum storytelling, we look at disseverance not in terms of a geometric space, right? And not in terms of time that's measured out in minutes and hours. And we're not measuring the matter either in terms of some metric. Okay, in disseverance, I can bring remote stuff near. In the blacksmithing world, there's a disseverance of this hammer, because the disseverance of the hammer has a living story of its own. I've talked about the Bailey hammer. I'll give you another little chapter in that story. Once, and only once, did I ever let an apprentice use this hammer. And I got carried away during the demonstration in my shop. Several masters watched in horror as this Bailey hammer was welded on the anvil on a piece of iron that wasn't all that hot by an apprentice. Now the reason you don't give a high quality hammer to an apprentice is they don't know how to use it, right? The reason it has to do with disseverance is because now this hammer has a particular closeness to me after I got chewed out by several master blacksmiths. One in particular came and gave me an hour lecture. Now disseverance in the art, that's an art, the quantum storytelling, this art in metal that's coming my way from the future. Okay, drafts have to do with the whole anti-narrative spiral. Again, anti means a bet. You go to Las Vegas, you make a bet, right? So this is a bet on the future. Anti also means before. So it comes before narrative. So before narrative solidifies, petrifies, as some people call it. Now, an anti-narrative, there's two that I'm very interested in. The spiral, anti-narrative spiral, and the more rhizomatic kind of networking assemblage processes of anti-narrative. We'll just focus on the spiral in terms of drafts. Now there is an updraft and a downdraft, right? That we can talk about in relation to spirals. The ontology of spirals is in Deleuze talks about moving to the left, it moves to the right, so there's a movement in the spiral. It has a certain directionality all its own. We've talked about directionality. Now talk about drafts. Drafts are forces of the spiral, anti-narrative, and these forces can be attracting you upward or repelling you downward. Now, I believe there's certain choice points. We talked about destiny or destining, and you can make a choice point, a turning point, to move from one draft to the other. Okay, so if you're headed towards the abyss and things aren't going well in your blacksmithing world and you're just going down and down, it's time to get some training, it's time to do something different about your processes so you can move over to an updraft. Dispersion, something talked about in Heidegger throughout his book, really. And it's not been a concept studied all that much that I could find anything on. So I'm looking at the dispersion of processes. Now, towards the end of the book, Being in Time, Heidegger talks about dispersion in relation to Nietzsche. And in terms of Nietzsche's three kinds of histories. You've got your history that's antiquarian. So you're just doing things in blacksmithing from the past. You're just doing stuff in a style that has these particularities like the Spanish style of the Southwest. But you're not really getting into anything beyond that. Then you have a monumental kind of history. The monumental history is really directed more at the future and is a dispersion towards the future. Then Nietzsche had the third one, which was the critical history, and that's where you get critical about things like what happened during the conquistador taking over Mexico and New Mexico, etc., or you go into Europe and you look at similar kinds of phenomena there, or you look at stuff like that around the world. Okay, the 11th process, the detaching. When it talks about detaching, we're into now a process where instead of evolving or developing or moving or drafting towards an authentic self, with detaching, we're looking at what do we need to detach that is pulling us away from that, right? So we need to detach some processes in order to have that attraction to whatever the artistic thing that you're developing. For me, it's the quantum storytelling art. So that means how do I detach from some processes where I'm just imitating others? There's some art, and you need to do that. You need to be able to imitate the masters to get down the technique, to understand how it works. But then how do you develop your own self? How do you develop the self that's authentic in terms of your own artistic expression? I'm interested in how can this detaching away from what's called the they self. The they self is just where you're imitating others, like you're imitating their style, but detaching from that allows you then to say, okay, I understand that draft. Now can I get into another anti-narrative that's moving me in to something more authentic? You detach from dependency on those particular styles and you integrate and develop your own. And I want to say something about where blacksmithing came from. I mean, blacksmithing was the original alchemy. You know, you're basically working with fire, you're blowing air through coals. Coals come from the earth, iron comes from the earth. It's one of the most abundant substances on the earth. And water that you use for quenching. So these are the four elements, but there's another element which is ether, which is a little bit more of a spiritual element. And now in the quantum physics, we're rediscovering these elements in an interconnectedness, you know, and how in the quantum wave particle world, how do these elements interrelate? how is our own body composed of iron? Iron in the blood, for example. How is carbon? Without carbon, it would be life. So I hope the 11 Ds have given you some language to work with quantum storytelling and an ontological approach to storytelling as well.
We make our own way. We live a life just like we used to do. Well, my friend, I tell you, I can't see tomorrow, but I'm living every minute of every day. So come and join the living human race. It's just in time we play. Singing songs about our freedom, make up to fulfill a dream. We're singing, time waits for no one. It's time we open up and see. You can't live your life without a dream. No, when it's time, break home free. I'm old enough to know the road I'm on, but young enough to feel the day. I wouldn't change a thing, cause life has been a dream. I've seen places I never thought I'd see. I come and join the living human race. It's just in time we play. We're singing songs about our freedom. We make up to fulfill a dream. Singing, time waits for no one. It's time we open up and see. Can't live your life without a dream. No, when it's time, break home free. And it's time, break home free. One time, break home free. And it's time.